is not a small thing that the Lord is close to hear, see, and rescue us from inherent and impending peril. It is too great a thing not to share in word and deed. Many of us, if not all of us, would raised with a familiar phrase. It may not be exact, but it conveys this thought that no one knows what he or she has until he or she loses it. It's a phrase that basically makes us think about the value of a possession, a gift that we have, that we may have taken for granted. So I do want to talk about God's gift in terms of His presence, we as receivers and we as representatives. That we as receivers, we do not and we should not minimize. I like that word, minimize. I like it in its clinical term. I like it in terms of engaging one another in conflict. I just told you something important and you just minimized it. You made it invalid. You just discarded it. Sometimes we come across something and we realize, wow, that was important. How did I forget that? Why did I take that for granted? As we receivers, we do not minimize God's saving presence. Why? Because it is not a small thing that the Lord is close to hear, to see, and rescue us. Why? Because He is not an indifferent God. Indifferent. I remember a professor, maybe it was in high school, said something that at first it took me a while to accept. The professor said that hate is not the opposite of love, that it was indifference. Well, that makes no sense. But after a while, after the years passed, I began to accept that indifference is worse than hate. Indifference can destroy a life. Indifference is one of the worst things that could happen to a human being. I watched a young man in a documentary talk about his experience, about 12 years old, him being homeless. And he said people would ignore me, they would just walk by. And I would sit in the bench watching people walk by, and he said, am I a ghost? And he said that crying. He said that in fear. That he thought for a moment, am I a ghost? That people could just walk by me, not ask me, why are you here by yourself? Why do you need anything? Indifference is the worst thing that could happen, one of the worst things that could happen to a human being. But God is not an indifferent God. God is not, as He has revealed Himself, not an uninvolved God. One of the worst things that I could hear in the news is a victim that had been jumped and beat up. And when that person is interviewed, the person says, and the worst thing was that people were there and they were just watching me being attacked. And no one did anything. They may have recorded it, but no one jumped in to help me. But God is not an uninvolved God. Despite what we feel at times, despite the rough times we go to, we have to bring that, those of us that have come to Christ, that into remembrance. We are insufficient in many ways to known or unknown dangers. Being self-sufficient and independent was a big thing for me when I learned that as growing up. That yeah, I want to be independent. I'm glad that my parents took care of me and fed me, but there was a time I wanted to break away. I wanted to be my own person. I wanted to generate my own income. Wanted to have my own home, make my own choices, problem solve. It's one of the questions we ask the students, and we try to get the students ready. As we interview students that have a disability, and we interview their parents, what do you want us to train them in so they could be independent? Do you want them to learn how to cook? Do you want them to have community awareness? Do you want them to be able to manage finances? Do you want them to be able to manage a household? Do you want them to have the ability to problem solve? Do you want them to have the ability to self-advocate for themselves? We all, at a point of our lives, we wanted to be independent. We wanted to be sufficient, to deal with problems as they come, to figure out how to resolve something, to be self-sufficient. But also, an important thing is to be able to ask for help, to humble ourselves when we realize that all the skills that I have acquired and developed is not sufficient to deal with this problem. I need help, to call out for that. Also, not only the ability to recognize a danger, but also accept that sometimes there's dangers that come out of nowhere that you did not see coming. But others could identify it for you. And these are problems because they take you off balance. They terrify you because you weren't aware or prepared for it. And the psalmist writes, I patiently was waiting for the Lord, and he turned to me and heard my cry. I serve a God that's always aware. But just for this songwriter in the Bible to put the fact that I felt as though he wasn't listening to me. So he let me cry out. And he turns to me. Wow. He turns to me. He heard my cry. I thought he was ignoring me. He turned to me. He heard my cry. Why? Because he's a God that saves from pits. He saves from pits that have gone dry and were meant for water, and you fall down to devastation. He saves us from dungeons designed to destroy us and to immobilize us. He is a God that saves us from traps set up by enemies, interior or exterior enemies. He saves us from any danger that comes in a metaphor that represents death, whether physical or spiritually. He is a God that saves from the pit. There were some graves that were dug in the old times, deep holes, and in those deep holes, there were side graves. These were holes that were filled with victims, and they were now dead. And the psalmist says, yes, no matter what image comes to my mind, he saves, he turns, he hears, he rescues me from a desperate and hopeless situation. This God that turns to us is the God that saves us from insincere engagement. Why did the songwriter in Psalm write that God did not want his offerings? Because there he says God wants sincere worship and obedience. He wants more than just religious motions. Even though his word represents what he expects from us that may appear ritualistic, nevertheless, if we just go through the motions, that does not please him. It has to be from his heart, from our heart. This is what the songwriter writes. David writes. He also says, aside from saving us from insincere engagement, He saves us from the inability to hear and follow. He writes that you may be a master, you may be a servant, but if your heart is ready to serve him for life, he pierces your ear. The servants that want to serve their masters back then, they had their ear pierced. And it wasn't one of those fancy places where they had the equipment to make it fast and quick, painless. These were usually tools that were meant for poke holes into leather. And it was done against the door. And it was pierced, and you had that pierced ear, representing that you were going to serve this master for life. Also, that he pierces our ears. There's another way to see the song, that he pierces our ear, in that he gives you the ability to open up your ears so you could hear him clearly and obey his voice, his desires. He doesn't only want you to obey him, he wants to give us the ability to obey him. And he sings and he writes that he is a flawed king, that God chose him to be a king, but he was a flawed king, an imperfect king that loved God and his law. And there he talks about he's remembering the copy of the law when he received the copy of the law when he was crowned king, anointed king. Some folks believe that part of the ceremony was to be wrapped on the scroll. But he was given a copy of the law, and he remembers that. And he says he received the law. In Deuteronomy, he talks about the law that's receiving, that was binding him. But also, he says, it is written about me in the scroll. He says, the scriptures, they write about me. I'm anointed. I got the feeling in listening and meditating is that he's saying, I'm a chosen one, but I'm limited. I'm limited. I'm not perfect, but he prepares me to be perfect. He prepares me to obey him. That his law is beautiful. That the fact that God intervenes in our lives is a beautiful reality, and he gives us his word, and that's a beautiful reality. He says, I'm chosen, but it humbles me. I'm anointed despite people saying, he's not much. But I'm anointed. I'm a king. Not perfect. But he puts up with me, and he gives me the tools to change me. It is written about me in the scrolls. Centuries later, a Jewish believer, follower of Christ, writes, a Hebrew writes in the Epistle of the Hebrews, describing that portion, it is written about me, is talking about the prediction of the coming Messiah. That this flawed king was promised a chosen King of Kings that would come through him. And John the Baptist says, the chosen one. And his disciples hear this, the chosen one. Then he describes him as the Lamb. And they pick up the Lamb that takes away the sin of the world. That is big. Because the Messiah they want is a hero Messiah that takes up the foreign nations. But foreign nations that were distant, that were promised that they would be reached and saved. He is the Lamb who takes away the sins of the world. He reveals that the chosen kings of kings can be slain in place of imperfect people, in place of sinners. There's a chosen king, was imperfect, but there's a chosen one that comes through that line that would take our place, and they took our place. God spoke his rescuing good news to us in his incarnated, historical, born Son, Jesus Christ. Therefore, we proclaim, as his incarnated presence, we proclaim his promises and singing of his glorious hope to all peoples. We as receivers. This is not a small thing. And as representatives, we don't bury, we don't conceal God's saving grace. Why? Because it is too great of a thing not to share in the word. It is indeed, it is too great of a thing to try to conceal it and hide it. He is God's incarnate presence. When we came to the incarnated Son of God, he put God's very nature in us. And how's that? Well, God's nature is his heart. And his heart is his love for the whole world. That is the biggest relevant thing about when he puts his nature in us. Isaiah, 700 years prior to all this, writes, "Hear this, you distant nations." And he says to those people and hearers a promise that make them light with the Gentiles. Those that were far from this revelation of this God that reveals himself as a single one. My salvation to reach the earth's end. Isaiah writes in this manner. And the psalmist, centuries later again, same songwriter, same song. I don't hide your righteousness in my heart. You're right. You're always right. Despite what we conjure up. Despite what we do in our schematics of building our world and worldview. You're the one that's always right. And I need your righteousness. And I cannot hide your righteousness in my heart. Did I ever tell you about the time I took a coworker to Applebee's and he embarrassed me? Some time ago, I took a coworker to Applebee's. Guy always dresses very conservative. People misunderstand him at the work site. I think it's part of it is a cultural difference, a big cultural difference, and many things that he does, meaning well, is misunderstood. The voice, the tone, everything, body gestures. It's just a cultural difference, and it's brought him some difficulties. What made it more outstanding to me is that he had this big Bible. And he's always on the side trying to preach to a coworker. And I said, oh man, this guy's going to get into trouble. He's not a seasoned believer. He just doesn't know how to share the word. And a few times I was taking parents and some co-workers to meet with the parents, and he was in one of our office rooms. Jesus! Jesus! And I told him, brother, and I had to close the door. You know, we got to use this room. And it was scheduled for us to use the room. So I thought he would give me a hard time, and he didn't give me a hard time. He got up and politely left us the room. But I saw him always intense in prayer, finding a spot to pray. And something told me, this brother is in trouble. Something told me, do something. So I invited him to Applebee's. This guy has a high position, by the way. So I invited him to Applebee's, and I kept my promise. He thought I forgot, and I came in from outside doing some observations, and I told him, are you ready? He says, yeah. He was happy. Took him to Applebee's, and he took forever to make order. And the place is crowded, and we get a seat, and it's crowded, and every time the waitress would come by, he would go, So around the fifth time, I said, she's waiting for us. You need help because we're going to be here forever. And we only got a limited time for lunch. So I showed him how to do it, and he never been to a restaurant. He's never been to a restaurant. And it surprised me because, this is a very intelligent man. He's never been to a restaurant. So we start talking, and I found out that he's the only Christian in his family. And I find out that he came into this country married with children. And he was raised in a whole different religion. I assumed that he was raised conservative Christian. No, way opposite. And he says, I was raised in this religion. He says, well, one day I'm walking by this small church and something tells me to go inside. And I go inside. I'm moved for what I hear, and I accepted Jesus. Then he tells me that his family began giving him a hard time. His immediate family, his wife, his in-laws, friends, that he dared to accept Christ, which is very against their belief. They're very precise in terms of Christ was a good man, but he was not born by a virgin. They're very specific in their teachings, because God cannot give birth. He was never crucified. They're very specific about that. That it may have been an impostor that went on the cross, but he did not die that way. Therefore, he never resurrected. Just a good man. They're very specific on that. And he accepts that. And he says, Jeff, I pray for my family. I pray for my friends. And I start off soft. And I slowly, it's just the way I'm raised, and I start praying loud, and I lose myself in prayer. And I'm thinking, that's a brother for me to keep an eye on. That's someone that I could draw strength from. He's working out his work with the Lord. And he's engaging in spiritual warfare. And many of us, we got it real good. We got it real good. Wife divorced him. He's trying his best to engage his now grown children. He's trying to find opportunities to share the gospel. And it's got him in physical danger. And I lost my place. Oh, okay. So Paul writes to a very troublesome, difficult church. And he tells them that they're sanctified. And he tells them that God, Jesus, can keep them firm to the end. So you would be blameless on the Lord's day. And why would he say that such a difficult church and group would be sanctified, to be made holy? It was because of their relationship to Christ, because everything they publicly confessed and moved away from and struggled with. Nevertheless, struggling, he reminds them that they're sanctified. They were sanctified, They're being sanctified, and they're going to be sanctified because of their relationship with God. They possess spiritual gifts, and they bragged about having spiritual gifts. They beat on each other. Who was more popular? Who was the better speaker? Who had the power to do this? Who had the power to do that? And they were plagued with strife, political views. They were plagued with that. What cannot be done, and also immoral things. And yet, he says, you're sanctified, but you're lacking the evidence of God's grace, and don't move away from that. He's just reminding them. John the Baptist's disciples, they get so excited. They hear, this is the Messiah. They kind of picked up, this is the Lamb. These are lambs that were used as sacrifice to remove the sins of God's people. Yet Isaiah writes again 700 years prior to that time, that the Messiah would offer his life. Strong controversy, strong conflict, yet Simon, brother, gets excited, Andrew, and tells him, listen, we have found the Messiah. And he brings him to Jesus. And Jesus gives him a new name. This hard-headed person gets a new name. You will be Cephas, the rock. But Cephas, translated Petra, means a small rock. Jesus, the big rock. Jesus, Petros. He was Petras. But you will be called Cephas. Because when God calls us, he gives us a new nature. And he gives us a new name. Showing that we're being sanctified. And we should not deny God's sanctifying power. We do this by practicing his incarnated presence. And the controversial sainthood that we model is this. It's a message from God's constant transforming, saving mercy, because that's what falling humanity constantly needs. That saving, transforming mercy. It's too great to hide.